Great. Awesome. Great. Yeah. We'll get started now. And before we kind of get into our session, I just wanted to, as always, begin by acknowledging that I'm joining you today from the unceded, ancestral, and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, um, also colonially known as Vancouver. I also want to recognize that SA Canada is a remote first organization operating across the country. Recognizing that Turtle Island was and remains home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. And as we gather in this virtual space today to talk about social innovation and impact, I also want to recognize that many of the ideas we're exploring, such as systems change, relationality, social innovation, community care, have been practiced by Indigenous communities on these lands for generations and generations. And as part of that, I think I maybe reflect on and acknowledge that social innovation as a field often talks about transformation and equity. Well, we are still learning what it means to do this work in ways that are accountable to the Indigenous peoples and communities on this land, and to do it in a way that also does not replicate the same systems that we're trying to change. So as we move today through today's conversation, I invite us all to reflect not just on impact, but on responsibility, how we show up, who we're accountable to, and then also what that means in the ways we support Indigenous sovereignty and work alongside our Indigenous kin on the land that we're on. Um, yeah, so I just wanted to quickly introduce myself. I'm Shikank Sharma. I work at Social Innovation Canada. I'm the sector lead. This session, which we'll get started with soon, is part of the Social Innovation Impact Initiative, which is a collaborative effort between Social Innovation Canada, the Winnipeg Boldness Project, and Maison de l'Innovation Sociale. Through this initiative, we want to co-build capacity of social innovation practitioners and labs and community members to strengthen the measurement practices and tell the deeper story of social innovation's impact. We also want to, where possible, deepen or augment the understanding of how social innovation works among those who resource it. Hopefully, by that, encouraging more adaptive funding models. As I'm incredibly grateful for the support of the Government of Canada Sustainable Development Goals program for this initiative. And we know that social innovators across this country are doing the heavy lifting of localizing the Sustainable Development Goals, whether they are tackling poverty, climate action, housing insecurity, inequality, income inequality. They're solving these very global problems that are discussed in the SDG agenda in very specific local contexts. But what we've often seen that traditional reporting some often fails these innovators. It asks for numbers that don't either capture the trust built, networks formed, or cultural shifts achieved. And so if we track only the what and ignore the how, we often lose the story of how change actually takes root. And so in a way, this initiative is exploring that critical question of how can we support social innovators to track their contributions in a way that is meaningful to them while still speaking to the macro level shifts of the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals agenda and also the broader economic, socio-environmental outcomes and impacts that different communities, provinces, or federal government are working towards. And so as a result, the final bullet on here is through this initiative, we're also aiming to build a national awareness by sharing stories of the impact and contribution of social innovation, of multi-sectoral collaborations, the impact that they're having across Canada. And with that said, and I think now most folks who were planning to join have joined. So now I'll turn it over to the more important people in the room. And so with that said, I'm thrilled to invite Diane Rusin from the Winnipeg Boldness Project to share her perspective on why our work today and why this relational approach is vital to the work of social innovation. Diane, go for it.
Also, miigwech shkank. Yes, Anin Buzu. Hello. I am Diane Rusin, and I am situated in this place called Winnipeg, Winnipeg, Manitoba, in Treaty One territory. And yeah, I feel like the reason I'm here is because of some of the things we want to talk about today, which is really about centering relationship. But I do want to start with a little bit of gratitude and just say thank you to everyone. Miigwech, we say in Anishinaabe, I'm Anishinaabe. And we know that time is probably the biggest gift we can give one another. And for you to take the time to be here today is really special to us, and so we deeply appreciate that. Yeah, and why am I here? Again, it's I think it's about relationship. I've had all kinds of connection to Social Innovation Canada, even before it was called Social Innovation Canada, um, and just have really been again blessed to hang around with some of the folks that are now at Social Innovation Canada and leading Social Innovation Canada, and have had lots of conversations about the work we do and trying to do that work better, trying to create tools that can do that work better. And I think this initiative is part of that. And so I was invited by Social Innovation Canada to help think about this and to think about how we might co-create and how we might steer this process. And so that's part of why I'm here. I do run Winnipeg Boldness, and it's an Indigenous-led social innovation lab, and it's been around for over 12 years now. As far as I know, that I'm aware of, we are probably the first and probably longest serving Indigenous social innovation lab in Canada. So, and we're still going strong and still looking for all the tools that can help us do our work better. And with this particular initiative, we really did set out to create a tool that would be super relevant to our social innovation community and to our social lab community. And I know many of you on the call probably have been involved in all kinds of different ways in that social innovation work or in that social innovation, or sorry, social lab community. And I know we have lots of conversations where we talk about the work we do as being sometimes really hard to describe to other people, and certainly trying to describe the value of the work we do has been difficult and challenging at times. And so trying to measure it or create, tell that impact story and show that impact story, I think I have found it challenging over the last 12 and a half years to find really great amount of tools or great tools that can help us do that work. So this is one of those attempts. And I think part of what I'm very committed to and what the folks are you're going to be hearing a little bit more from today is, we're really committed to designing tools, and this particular tool with our community, and so that it will really be then therefore relevant to our community. And so that's why a lot of you are here, and some of you have already been involved. There's quite a process, and you're going to hear a little bit more about it in a bit. But there's been a lot of interaction, a lot of engagement so far, and that is the plan moving forward. So, and if again, I have found in my own experience that trying to find impact measurement tools or evaluation tools even for a social lab has been difficult. So much of the evaluation world is based on program evaluation, and we're not a program at Boldness. And as a social lab, we're not designing programs. We're trying to design prototypes. And so how might we, again, measure that value add, or that value of that and the impact of that? And then the other, yeah, so it can be what we're trying to do, I think, so far, and what we're hearing a lot of is the idea of centering relationality, which is a little bit different than perhaps some of the approaches that maybe a Western paradigm might privilege. And so it's not necessarily linear, it's not less necessarily logic based, it's not the logic model, the inputs, outputs, and so on and so forth. I think it's the work we do is way more comprehensive and sophisticated and therefore at times complex than that. And so, yeah, it can definitely be messy. It can definitely be very exploratory, very iterative, very emergent. And so, how might we find tools that really capture that and show the value of that is what part of what we're trying to do here. And so, how how, again, just how do we even measure or capture the real work, like the on the ground and the day-to-day work that we're doing. And so the idea of centering those relationships as being very core to what we're doing, not sort of just a nice to have or an add-on or yeah, something just a little bit more adjacent. It's actually at the center. And so we know that and for me, when you are in very strong, committed relationships with those around you, that just naturally leads to accountability. And so if I'm in a really strong, positive relationship with you, I'm accountable to you. Like I show up for you. I will go to the ends of the earth for you. I'm interested in your health and wellness. You're interested in mine. And then we're just accountable to each other when we're in that kind of relationship. And so often, at Boldness, we're trying to be as in that really good a relationship with our community as well. And so, how might we build tools that show that kind of accountability? Certainly, by nature of the funding we receive, we definitely are accountable to our funders. And so I feel like there's lots of default in that for most of us that as part of the funding, we do have to be accountable to our funders. And there's other audiences and other partners and other stakeholders that we can be accountable to as well. And for me, community is a big one. And so, how might we build a tool that helps show that accountability or measure that accountability or the impact of that accountability? So, I know that word accountability can sometimes um, have different meaning and be used in different ways for different people. So, I think part of this process is about coming to a shared understanding of what we mean by that word, and then therefore how is this tool going to look and how are we going to build this tool together? So I just wanted to give a little bit of that, a little bit of context in addition to what Shikank has already shared. And at this point, I think I'm going to turn it over to Greg and my colleagues, Greg and Victoria, who are going to do a deeper dive and get right into the tool and tell us where we've come from and where we're going. So, miigwech for listening, and over to Greg and Victoria.
Thank you so much, Diane and Shikank, for this introduction and contextualization of this project. I'm here today with Victoria, my colleague. We both work at la Maison de l'Innovation Sociale. We're based in Montreal. And we have worked very closely with Social Innovation Canada on this project since September, more or less, and with 8 participating labs that I'll mention in a second. I also just wanted to mention that it's Victoria's birthday today, so happy birthday to Victoria. And she will be sharing the screen and we will begin the presentation. The presentation itself should last about 45 minutes. There's a lot of information to cover. And as you'll see on the first slide that should be appearing, this is a work in progress. So basically, this is a co-design process, and we've participated, as I mentioned, with 8 different labs across the country and with Social Innovation Canada to to reflect on the unique contributions of social innovation practitioners and leaders, and to sort of show, as Diane was mentioning, what are those unique contributions of social innovation labs and practitioners, because they're hard to communicate sometimes in terms of the impact that those labs have. So that's the main goal of this work in progress. But as a secondary goal, we also want to build funders' understanding of systems change work, and we want to enable more adequate resourcing and funding, perhaps, for practitioners and labs. So that's just to mention that this is a work in progress, and at the end of the presentation, we will have time for feedback because we want your feedback. As I said, this is a work in progress, and this is a second version of this framework, this impact evaluation framework that we're calling a relational accountability framework. So a little bit more about that in a second. And we do want to improve this version with your feedback. So we'll have time at the end to do that. And throughout the presentation, maybe in 3 occasions, we'll pause and we'll ask a question just to engage with the audience here, and through Mentimeter, be able to collect some feedback as well that way. So we can continue. Victoria is presenting the slides here for us. So thank you, Victoria, for your help. So basically, this is a co-design process, as I've mentioned, and we really approach this, in terms of our approach, it's a design thinking approach. And in design thinking, we always think of, okay, there's a tension here that we'd like to address. And so for us, the tension is that impact evaluation has long been a source of tension for social innovation practitioners. Evaluation frameworks most commonly used today assess impact, but are not always built for the relational depth that Diane was mentioning, the complexity of social innovation as a process, and the different time horizons, whether it's short-term, mid-term, or long-term horizons. The frameworks used today don't always account for all of those things. And so as a result, the most meaningful contributions of practitioners often go unmeasured or are undervalued. And we've already mentioned some of them, but it's the relationship building aspect that we're really focusing on here. And also the centering of learning, both as a process and an outcome of our projects, of our different initiatives. And as also Diane mentioned, the iteration, so the iterative nature of social innovation in itself. So basically, those are the tensions that we identified as a group, so the 8 participating labs, and the things that go unmeasured. And as the title sort of indicates, we are framing this as a relational accountability framework for social innovation practitioners. So as we mentioned, the word itself, accountability, is a little bit fraught, or a little bit, there's so many definitions for it. So basically, in our approach to this framework, we're asking 2 questions. So who are we accountable to? And how do we build accountability across the relationships that shape our work? And the goal here is to make accountability more visible and embedded in social innovation practice. So we can revisit that term at the end of the presentation to see if it makes more sense to us now. So we're basically reframing accountability in more relational terms. Thank you, Victoria. And so now we'd like to ask you a question about accountability in the context of social innovation. When you hear the word accountability, what comes to mind? And you have a QR code for a Mentimeter, and we'll produce a word cloud based on your responses. So when you hear the word accountability, what comes to mind for you? Take a minute to answer that question, please. Relationship, transparency, trust, ownership, dynamic, due diligence, power dynamics, results, showing up, delivery, being of your word, yeah, trustworthiness, progress, building trust. So I see that from your responses, you're quite aligned with our reframing of the word accountability, because usually in the field of social innovation, or even in the corporate world, accountability is really about, in French, we call it reddition de comptes. So making sure that you're accountable to the different objectives that have been set. And so here we're really focusing on the relational aspect. And I see that in your responses, so are you already. So we're quite aligned, and that's not a bad thing. Thank you, Victoria. So in terms of the structure for the presentation, there's basically 4 sections. The first section that I will begin in a second is presenting the framework. The framework architecture is what we've called it. So it's the components. in terms of an impact evaluation framework, what are the different components that we have included in this approach that we're sharing with you today? Then the second section is really the foundational principles. As we've mentioned already, we're centering this on relationships, but we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about the three foundational principles that guided our work. And here we're presenting it first in terms of the framework, architecture, and then the principles. But in the design process, we actually started with the principles. What are the principles that orient our work? And then we came up with the components for the framework architecture. But here we wanted to still show you a visual representation of the framework before talking about the foundational principles. And then the third section, we're going to talk about 4 practical tools that social innovation practitioners can use. And hopefully they'll be practical to you. And then the fourth section is the feedback. And that's where we can really do a deep dive into, do you feel that this is, are there practical applications to not only the framework in itself, but the tools that we're proposing as a result of our approach to impact evaluation? Does this speak to you? And we'll do that in the last section for today. So we can begin with section 1, the framework architecture. And here what we're proposing is a model of how transformational change emerges in the process of social innovation. Don't be overwhelmed. I won't be talking in depth here as I'm presenting this visual. I just wanted to show you the different elements that I will be talking about in the next sections. And here, to your right, you can see the legend that we're using to read this visual representation of the framework. So we have 3 what we call process actors. So 3 groups of people, organizations, you can call them networks, that I'll talk about in a second with more detail. So we have, for example, the community partners, different agents of change, you can call them. We also have the labs and the practitioners themselves, who are sometimes part of the community, but sometimes work as, the people who have a certain level of expertise in terms of social innovation practices, prototyping, experimental practices. And then, of course, you have, as another process actor group, the funders and what we call the system actors, like policymakers, for example. So those are the 3 process actor groups that we'll be talking about. But as Diane mentioned, we're going to be talking about the relationship between those actors. And as you may have noticed, it's hard to read the actual font there, but what's in the center of all this is the complex challenge space. And I'll explain why we placed that at the center of this diagram in a second. And there's 2 types of relationships, if you will, or flows between these different elements. You have the feedback flows between the process actors, but you also have the flows between the process actors and the complex challenge space. So just in terms of what is happening where, I just wanted to mention those elements before diving more deeply into them. We can go on to the next slide. Oh yeah, and sorry, can you go back just for a second, Victoria? I did forget to mention that all of this is encircled by the ecosystem, and this is important. And we did want to highlight that. And so in the dark green is an ecosystem. We don't operate in an abstract space. We operate in even though sometimes we work virtually, we still operate in a real, real life space. And so the first component that we're going to talk about, you can go to the next slide, Victoria, thank you, is the ecosystem. And so here, what we would like to represent visually is that the process actors are embedded in an environmental, a cultural, and a political context that both shape and are shaped by our work. So we're not floating in an abstract space. We're actually, shaping an ecosystem, but also ecologically, we're rooted, we're grounded. Our labs exist in different cities across the country. And the processes themselves, the prototyping, the experimenting, the projects themselves have an impact on an ecosystem that is environmental, that is political, and of course cultural as well. So that's the first component that we wanted to represent in our diagram, is the ecosystem layer of all of this. All of this activity and all of these relationships are grounded in a particular ecosystem. The next component that we wanted to highlight, and this is almost in order of importance here. So starting with the ecosystem, now we go on to the challenge, the complex challenge space that we have placed at the center of this framework. And so the key idea of this framework is that impact evaluation in the context of social innovation, it's a knowledge building practice. And so accountability means being responsive to what we learn as the challenge evolves, as the knowledge that we have about the challenge evolves, and as the relationships, that are happening around this complex challenge space evolve as well, and sometimes shift. And we'll talk about power dynamics in a second. Those relationships often shift over the course of the duration of a project, which in our case at the Maison de l'Innovation Sociale is frequently can last for more than a year. And I'm sure some of the work that you do is similar. So the relationships change over time, and the information that is emerging out of the complex challenge space, the knowledge that we have evolves as well. And so we really wanted to place that at the center of all of this. So we can go on to the next slide. And so in terms of the relationships, we have named the 3 process actors here. So these are actor groups that share responsibility for tracking and translating the change that happens. So as I was saying, our relationships evolve, the knowledge that we have evolves as well. And basically one of our responsibilities, and it's a shared responsibility, is not only to track the changes that are happening in this emerging iterative process, but also translating it so that the different actors can understand, how the sense-making aspect of these changes. And this is really important for the funders, notably because they're the ones who often are funding the work, but they have to understand what are the things happening at the community level, the expertise that's being shared at the lab level. And if they better understand it, then they'll be sort of more apt or more enabled to be able to, intervene in a positive way. And so at the outset of any initiative, we must ask a couple of questions. Who is positioned to contribute to this project, to this initiative? And how are those contributions shared and coordinated among the different people involved in a project or an initiative? And the reason why that's an important question is because they're not necessarily shared equally, and that dynamic could and should maybe change over time. So a question that maybe we have for you right now, in the next slide. In your current lab or initiative, who carries most of the evaluation burden? So this is just out of curiosity. We've tried to represent here a generalized picture of how social innovation practices occur in terms of the different actor groups that we've identified. It may be slightly different in the context of your own work, but in the context of your own work, who carries most of the evaluation burden in terms of doing the work, the evaluation work, but also in terms of communicating that work, and who is sort of funding that work as well. So are you doing it just for the funders? Are you doing it more for the community, more for yourself internally as a team? So myself was the first answer. The lab stewards. So this is in terms of the burden. So who's doing the hard work of evaluation? The practitioners, the staff at the lab, conveners, which is often the labs as well. The grant making staff. So here we can see the relationships with the funders more explicitly. The external evaluators. So sometimes, yeah, that's a good point. Sometimes evaluation is done externally by somebody who's not part of the practices, the day-to-day practices of a lab. Hired consultants, similar. Implementation specialists, so also people with maybe specific expertise in evaluation. The community here, somebody mentions the community providing data. They carry a burden as well, just by providing data in the first place, absolutely. Me, lol. Great. So this gives us a nice portrait of how you're carrying out evaluation work right now. I think we can move on to the next slide, Victoria. Thank you. And we can see it's quite diverse in terms of who's carrying the burden right now. And just before I move on to the foundational principles, we also wanted to mention that what we're proposing in terms of this diagram that I showed you is a model of change. So together, these framework layers and components describe how transformational change emerges through the interaction between the context, so the ecosystem, through the actors, and is collectively constructed through the understanding of the complex challenge space or the problem. So we're proposing that this framework is not only can be used not only as an evaluation tool, but also as a relational model of change. And this we mentioned this because it came up in the conversations we've had in the process of building this framework or this version of the framework. And so that those three process actors and centering the complex challenge space at the center of it and the different types of relationships is really a model for how a change happens. And a key word here is systemic change. So one of the challenges that we mentioned at the beginning is that the complexity of the work is is undervalued, if you will, and underreported. So this model tries to make the smaller changes that happen maybe at the community level, how do those smaller changes translate into more systemic ones? So I think we can now move on to the next section, which is the three foundational principles, what inspired us to create this model, this framework. And so there are three. The first one, Diane mentioned it very clearly because it is very important to us. In the approach that we've adopted, is that the framework should be rooted in relational practices. So here, the key idea is that social innovation unfolds through relationships. And the signals of change include the learning generated through the relationships, but also the shifts in the relationships, both as impacts in themselves, but also as enablers of more systemic change. So these shifts in relations must be made visible and tracked alongside more conventional indicators, because if we're centering relational practices and relationships, period, we have to not only track them, but translate that information in terms of what does this mean in terms of more systemic change. And here I want to mention the types of relationships between the actor groups. So if you look at the community partners in more a darker green, so community partners and the agents of change, the relationship that they have to the social innovation practitioners and the labs is a relationship of anchoring and experimenting. Anchoring because most of the experimentation is done in a specific community. So it's anchoring that experimentation in that community, so that the relationship is more of an anchoring one, more of an experimenting one. The community is basically partnering with these labs and helping them in the sense-making process as well. But that sense-making is not only with the communities. Labs and practitioners help the funders understand those changes as well. So the relationship between the social practitioners and the labs with the funders and policymakers is a relation of sense-making and a bridging in the sense that we're helping the funders understand what is happening in terms of change and impact in the communities, making sense of that information, trying to explain how those shifts in relationships have impact as in terms of enabling more systemic change. And then finally, the relationship between the funders and the community, it's a relation of enabling and structuring. So because the financing is coming from the funders, Well, they're enabling the experimentation, allowing it to happen, and they're giving a structure to the social innovation process in itself. And as you can see, it's a two-way arrow. The dotted line is the arrowheads point both ways. But we did want to sort of name the types of relationships between the three different process actors to sort of highlight the fact that we're rooting the framework in relationships, in relational practices. So that was the first principle. But principle number two is, again, going back to the complex challenge space, we're centering our framework on learning and on the complex challenge at hand. So when we talk about accountability, accountability in this approach means being responsive to what we learn as our knowledge of the challenge evolves. And so the key idea here, once again, and I'm repeating this because it's really foundational to our approach, is that an impact evaluation in social innovation is a knowledge building practice. We're building knowledge through the relationships and through the interaction between these different process actors. And it's the learning itself that is at the center. And when we say learning, well, learning about what? About the problem, about the complex challenge space. And so this goes to writings in the field of complexity studies, where knowledge is built by stabilizing a challenge or a problem, coordinating around the challenge, and then adjusting approaches or recombining capabilities to better address the challenge. And so that's really at the center of this. And yes, the first principle is core, the relational practices, but this one is equally important and fundamental to our approach. It's centering learning and being accountable to the problem that we're trying to address. And we're building knowledge, and as the knowledge is built, that's when we're able to better communicate something that's related to this third principle. So the third principle is that the framework is defined by a shared sense making. So shared being the key word here. The sense making is a shared responsibility. It shouldn't be the burden of just the labs or the community. It's a shared sense making across the actors and across different cycles of learning. So it's an iterative process. And so each actor group tracks different dimensions of change and makes them legible across the system. And so here we notice that there's perhaps a structural gap between what happens in practice and what is recognized as impact. And so one of the goals for this framework is to make contributions more visible, because currently they're invisible, or they're undervalued, or they're undermeasured. So the implication here is that there's a need to support shared sense-making across the different actors in terms of how change unfolds through relationships over time and across the systems. And so the tools that we're going to be proposing in a second really address that structural gap in terms of making those different types of contributions more visible so that we could build that knowledge together and coordinate around the problem and then recombine our capabilities to better address it. So another question for the Mentimeter, which aspects of impact are most difficult to capture in your current evaluation practice? So if we want to make your contributions more visible, the question, it begs a question, which contributions do you feel are more difficult or are more invisible at this moment in time in your current evaluation practices? What do you feel is undervalued or under-captured, if you will, in your current evaluation practice? Feel free to share those answers with us before we present the tools. And take your time. We're doing good on time. The social capital building, absolutely. We're going to talk about that in a second. Causality, absolutely. Causality, we can add correlation. The qualitative, not just to support stats, but qualitative for qualitative sakes. So again, qualitative metrics, mindset shifts, relationship building, long-term impacts, inequities and behavior changes, partnership and collaboration, societal impact, conditions for change, well-being. And I can't read the other ones, but these are amazing. These are great. And we'll be able to keep this as a record of today's meeting, of today's webinar. This is great. Well-being, I think that one's really important. Relationships between partners that are a result of our programming, emotions, trust, absolutely, 100% with all of these responses. Super. Behavior change, shifts in mental models, not a business case. That's not the focus here. Great. So hopefully, when I present the tools, maybe they'll resonate with some of these things that are harder to capture and that are often undervalued in current frameworks. And I see that people are writing in the chat. That's great too, as a space to share. Any thoughts on these questions or these topics. Don't hesitate. We're going to capture all of this as feedback on this framework. So which leads us to the penultimate section of this presentation, the 4 practical tools. And this is more of an invitation. As I mentioned, it's a work in progress. We want to make sure that what we're presenting here or co-designing with the participating labs, we hope that it's practical, that it's useful to the different labs and to many practitioners. We have 60 to 70 people in the webinar today. So we do want to make sure that this is practical, that it doesn't stay just at an abstract level. So here are 4 tools that sort of emerge as possible ways to use these principles in a more applied way. So we can start with the first one. So, as an introduction, the following tools bring shared sense-making across different actors into practice by making visible how change unfolds across contributions, time, scale, and system pathways. So the first one, tool number 1, somebody mentioned social capital building. So this one, we've called it, it's a similar term, it's almost a synonym, it's asset mapping. And the purpose of this tool is to make actor contributions visible and to understand what each of those different process actor groups, what do they bring to the process itself. And so we've identified 6 dimensions or 6 types of assets: financial resources, relational capabilities, expertise and knowledge, structural access, decision-making authority, legitimacy, and voice. And so you're able, when you start a project and you have the first meeting with your stakeholders or the different people participating in the project, you can actually sit down and fill out the spider map to see how are those capabilities or assets distributed along those dimensions. And so it's a very useful level setting tool to understand what each actor is bringing to the project and how this evolves over time. You can also identify gaps. So I'm in the guiding questions, like, okay, so once we do this, what questions should we ask ourselves? And so who holds which types of assets? Is it the community who has more capabilities or assets in terms of legitimacy and voice? Who has decision-making authority in this process or more of it? Who gives structural access? Who has expertise and knowledge? So how is this mapped out for each of the different actors on a project? And then the follow-up question to that, of course, is where are the gaps? Where are there missing assets, or is there too much of a concentration of in terms of power dynamics in one or more than one of the actors involved? And what assumptions are we making at the onset of the project in terms of making these contributions more visible and more transparent in a way would also be another word that we can include here for this tool. So that's tool number 1. Tool number 2 is a time and scale matrix. So in the conversations that we've had with the 8 participating labs, we've had a lot of focus on in terms of those conversations. A lot of focus was placed on not only the time horizon, so short term, midterm, and long term, which we've represented here with H1, H2, and H3. At la Maison de l'Innovation Sociale, where Victoria and I work, short term is like 0 to 2 years. And then midterm is more like 2 to 4 years. And H3 would be beyond 4 years. But that changes with each lab. It might be different for you. But just to give you an idea of the time horizons that we operate with, those are the ones that we use. But it's not only in terms of the desired outcomes in terms of our short-term goals, midterm goals, and long-term goals, or impacts, if you will, but it's also the different scales of the impact. And here we've identified three levels: micro, mezzo, and macro. Oops. We can go back to two. Yeah, micro, mezzo, and macro. And so just to name some of these, so basically this tool also at the beginning of an initiative, at the beginning of a project, you should write down what are the desired impacts of the project in terms of short-term goals, midterm goals, and long-term goals, but also in terms of micro level, at the mezzo level, and at the macro level. And here, some people can't see the visual. So if hopefully you can, and basically here what we're presenting is for the micro level, mezzo level, and macro level, different examples of what that means. So for short term at the micro level, community voice. So immediate participation and voice amplification is a desired outcome of our work in the short term and at the micro level. Also short term, but at the mezzo level, so rapid prototyping. Let's get a prototype going to test a service or to test the model of an intervention with the partners that we're working with. That's on the short term. So for us, it's 0 to 2 years, but it's not at a micro level, it's more at a mezzo level. And then at the macro level, did this rapid prototyping generate some change in the mindset of in the public sector with a city worker, and they see like a policy window opening up in terms of the impact of that rapid prototyping. So all of that is happening in the short term. In the midterm, we have more like capacity development, and which is a big focus of our work actually. And so at the micro level, that might mean skills and knowledges, the relationships develop over time. At the mezzo level, that can mean a growth in terms of the network of, building cross-sector collaboration and more of a collective capacity. And at the macro level, it's more structural transformation. So shifts in cultural norms, resource allocation, coordination with, either policymakers or people who work at the government, whether it's at the municipal level, provincial level, or federal level. And then in the long term, well, here we're talking more about cultural shifts. That's what we would expect to see in the long term. So 4 years plus for us. And it could be at the micro level, but it could also be at the mezzo level. So changes in terms of practices. We work a lot with the city of Montreal. So, as an outcome of our project, has there been any changes in terms of the practices at the city level? And then institutional adoption of those practices. Is it, are there new regulatory norms that are being instituted in the government, whether it's at the municipal, provincial, or federal level? So this is a model. You can adapt this based on your own work, based on your own needs, and based on the desired outcomes of the project at hand. Again, centering this on the complex challenge space that you're going to be working on. But the idea is not to forget the differences, if you will, between short-term, midterm, and long-term, but also in terms of, are we talking about a micro scale, a mezzo scale, or more of a macro scale? And here, if we go to the next slide, it's the same tool, basically. So tool number 3 is using this same matrix of, scale and time horizons. You do successive snapshots of using this same matrix. So if you look here at the bottom left would be the first one, the one that you do at the onset of a project. And then, you establish, okay, by the fall of 2026, we should revisit our matrix and see how we're doing in terms of the short-term outcomes of this project at the different scales. Are we still aligned? Do we still have the vision in terms of the end results? So this is a little bit like a theory of change, if you will, that many social innovation labs use in their practices. So it's basically taking successive snapshots of this matrix to revisit the desired outcomes of a project, and then you would end. So we go from the one on the bottom left to the one on the top, and then on the bottom right, at the near the end of the project, well, you revisit it once again, and you see, okay, how did this matrix change over time? How did the relations shift over time? Where is impact emerging? Where do transitions? Are we approaching the desired transitions, or the ones that we foresaw at the beginning of the process? So here we're trying to anticipate transition moments where new forms of partnership or capacity may be needed. So we're identifying those shifts sort of as they happen. So it's basically the purpose of this tool is to track the evolution of a portfolio or a project. Which leads us to the last tool, which I find really interesting because it's the more creative one, and it's the one that I think is still as a draft, if you will, in terms of how different labs or practitioners can use this. So basically, the tool number 4 is approaches to visual storytelling. And here we mentioned that we want this to be useful to different practitioners and labs. And we want them to be able to use these tools to translate the process of change. And so we're suggesting here that visual storytelling is a great way, both for us, when I say us, I'm referring to labs, for us to understand the process of change. And here, the first tool that we're showing is a diagram or a narrative map, where that reveals the iterative nature of the process through these arcs that we're showing here. So the different points along the line, they're basically the key moments of a process. In our case, the first phase is always understanding the problem. The second phase is prototyping, and the last phase is experimenting with the prototypes. But sometimes you have to go back and you have to say, you know what, our understanding of the problem, we were wrong, or we weren't quite correct. And so we have to do some course correction. And so that's what these arcs are representing, that sometimes, even though you advance along the lines, along the points of the line, you have to go back and revisit your understanding of the problem before you continue. The size of the dots, the size of the points, could represent the complexity of the coordination between the actors. So there are certain moments during the process where you're going to have to coordinate with more people, and that increases the complexity level of the work that you're doing. Sometimes you're just working with the internal members of your team, but sometimes you're working with all of the stakeholders. And so you can represent that with the size of the dot, of the point along the lines. And then you can see that below, so each of these phases, if you can sort of distinguish here 3 distinct phases. Each of those have like steps along the way. And so those steps could be represented, and you can actually create a storyboard for each of those steps. And the dots below those steps, those are the learnings. So you'll have sometimes many learnings that at the end of the phase 1, where you think you understand the problem that you're working on. Oh, yeah, we've learned a lot about the problem. And you'll have many dots there, and that you could fill in with text. And, oh, yeah, this is what we've learned. And you can just map it. So this is a narrative mapping of the process itself. You could fill it in as you go along. You can do it at the end. You could, do it at many times. But the idea here is to develop a mapping system, a narrative way to tell your story. And that's just one way. And it's, Kumu is a great map. I'm seeing some of the comments as they appear. We've used Kumu before. It was a great way to do that. Mural is another one. But the idea here, the invitation, if you will, is to come up with your own way to narratively map the work that you do, to represent the things that we're naming here. the iterative nature of the process, the complexity in terms of the coordination around the problem space, and again, we're centering learning here. So what do you learn at each phase of the process? But I've added a question here. Does this narrative mapping allow you to identify the people involved in the process or the people touched by the process? I think that not exactly. So no narrative mapping will be 100% effective for all of the needs that we have as labs. So the next idea in terms of approaches to visual storytelling, you can go to the next slide, Victoria, is storyboarding. So if you notice the panels below the arcs, so each step along the way, you could storyboard each of those steps. And this is a project that we did about a year and a half ago with Social Innovation Canada. And it was a project called the Housing Resilience Lab. And we basically storyboarded for 3 neighborhoods of Montreal, starting with Côte des Neiges at the left of your screen, and Park Extension and Villeray-Saint-Michel in the middle, and Montreal North on the right side. So basically, what were the issues in terms of the housing issues, but also as they intersect with the climate crisis? What were the citizens saying in each of those neighborhoods? And you know, how do policies respond to those issues? Are they responsive to those issues or not? So we decided to map it out, and we did this through graphic storytelling. So basically, it's a storyboarding of it's data. All of this is data, but presented in a visual storytelling way. And so this is sometimes very useful to address that last question that I had posed. Does the mapping represent the voices of the people that are involved in the process and are touched by the process? The first example I found didn't really address those voices, but this second example does. So when we say approaches to storytelling, that's what we mean. You have to find a way, depending on the types of projects that you're working on. And again, the important thing is to center learning in the process, to center relationships, and the shared responsibility in terms of the sense making, because that's what you're going to be communicating to the funders. And like I was saying at the beginning, we want to make sure that the changes happening at the community level, how can we translate those changes and express them in systemic vocabulary? We can go on to the next slide. So the conclusion here is that, as you can see, we're trying to reframe impact evaluation by saying that traditional frameworks are not necessarily built for the relational depth that we're used to. They're not built for the complexity of social innovation, and they're not necessarily built for long-term horizons, so 4 years plus. They want immediate results. And so what often goes unmeasured is the relationship building, which we're centering here, as we are doing the same for the learning, both as a process and as an outcome, and the iterative nature of this process. And so what we want to emphasize here as we're ending our presentation is that impact evaluation must evolve to make these contributions more visible. And just a note in closing before we gather your feedback, we're going to have a good 10 minutes to do so. This is a living architecture. As I said at the beginning, this framework is designed to evolve through practice. And we're really presenting this to you today to get your feedback. What do you feel about this? Well, we have a few questions to ask in a second. But basically what we're trying to say is that shifts in relationships is really what drives systemic change. Building on this premise, the framework focuses on who contributes to the process, how actors coordinate around the challenge, and what is learned in the process. What the tools enable is tracking these shifts, making the shifts more visible, and translating them into a coherent account of impact and more systemic change. So the outcome, hopefully, is a clearer understanding of how social innovation contributes to broader system change. Thank you for your attention. I know that's a lot of information, but to give you time to respond to this presentation, we have a few questions, and this is we're going to take your answers orally, not through Mentimeter. So, what resonates with your work or experience in terms of what we've just presented? And is there anything that you would adapt or that you want to challenge us on, or maybe push back a little bit on? But before you respond, it's always good, take a minute. Let's maybe not two because of the time, but take at least 1 minute to write down your thoughts. And in 1 minute, we'll turn the mics on, if you will. You can just raise your hand by pressing on the react button, and we'll take your questions that way. I think we can begin. It was a quick minute, but I think we're ready. It's already 3:05 in Montreal. Thank you, Bethany. So, comments, does this resonate with you? Are there ways that you can use this framework and adapt it to your own practices? If so, how? Just maybe share what aspects did you find most useful, perhaps? That's a good way of starting. Don't be shy to share with, we'll turn on your mic if they're not turned on, or you can go ahead and turn on your mic. As we mentioned,
chat, if you wanted to read that out loud.
Or the chat, yeah. Let me see. Yeah, that is a challenge. Kamal, getting funders, that's one of we mentioned it and Shakank mentioned it as well. Like we're trying to build funder capacity here to understand how system change happens. So that is a challenge, but hopefully these tools will help. I think that in terms of overcoming those challenges, I mentioned that here at La Maison de l'Innovation Sociale, we're involved in a lot of prototyping, experimenting. We have to test these tools in real life and see if they're useful or not. Not only for us as practitioners, but for the community, but also for funders as well. So I'd be able to maybe answer that question in a year or so.
Greg, I think there was a Gerardo who unmute themselves. Maybe they wanted to speak.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Gerardo.
Yeah, no, thank you. I was thinking just on the sense of the importance of relationships. I am currently sitting on the funder side, and one of the challenges that we are seeing with the actors that we are working with is that they themselves are not seeing how meaningful. I mean, it's in your slide. Shifts in relationships drive systemic change. Is something that we all understand in this call, but it is not often with the actors who are on the frail who understand this. So these 4 tools, I'm finding it really helpful to be able not to convince them, but to show them that the key here is the shift in relationships, which is what unlocks the many other things that we need to be doing together.
Yes. Yeah. And just to echo the sentiment, I think that the funders are part of that relationship. So when I say that at the center of all of this, we're placing the complex challenge space, and that in and out of that challenge space, the funders have a responsibility. When I talk about shared sense making, so their view of the challenge space might change over time. And so it's really the relationship between the actors, but also in relation to the complex challenge at hand. And I think that's really important because, as I mentioned, this is a knowledge building exercise, if you will. And so our relationship to the problem also changes. When I say problem, I mean the complex challenge that we're addressing. Yeah, and as I'm reading some of the comments, I'm adding a few thoughts that come to mind that might not address directly the comments, but I'm reading a comment here in terms of fully satisfying various accountability expectations. I totally agree. It's probably this framework can't answer everything, but we try to develop something that is applicable across many different types of labs, which is very hard to do because each lab are going to do different things and in a different way, perhaps. But there are certain shared practices I think that we have. Sony.
Thanks so much for the amazing presentation. I was part of the Edmonton Shift Lab and the first batch, which was looking at
Yeah.
the intersection between racism and social impact, I guess. And I also, I mean, I was there in Toronto when everything started too. So I feel like it's been over 20 years of social innovation labs. And I've seen their growth, I've seen the difference. And one of the things that I can't get over is when you say micro, meso, and macro,
Mm.
like nothing's shifted, nothing's
Mm.
changed. There have been so many innovation spaces, Mount Royal, University of Alberta, Montreal, UBC,
Mhm.
Waterloo, but I don't see any change happening systemically, nor do I see it happening in the context of community sometimes. So my question is like, even though we keep on recreating these different tools and processes
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
sense making, like where is the behavior change happen? And also in the context of funding, like how are the funders influenced to shift their own ways of doing evaluation? Because they're
Yeah.
not shifting. You have to have a very liberal, progressive funder to do that. And it's very hard to find that. So I'm just asking where those pressure points you think are at this point after 20 years of lab making.
That's a fabulous question. Very difficult one to answer, but I do have a take on it. But it's just again part of an answer, not a complete answer. And I think that part of the problem of what you're stating here is that not everyone, and when I say everyone, it includes funders, but it includes the different labs and practitioners. Not everyone has the same theory of change, if you will, in terms of how we see systemic change happening. And for me, like we often talk about having common language to talk about social innovation. And I don't know if this is necessary or not, but we don't have a common understanding or a way of seeing how systemic change actually happens. And because of that, there's a lot of work being done across the board and over 20 years or more. But there's not a common understanding of how this is generating change or the change that we'd like to see. So I think it's an ongoing question, and this is the beginning of an answer to that question. And I think there's more work to be done. Like this is basically a proposal in terms of how to approach impact evaluation in the context of social innovation practice. But I think that a subsequent part of this work has to be addressing the question that you just raised. What is the change that we would like to see, and how does social innovation practice contribute to that change? And to do that, you're going to have to develop some kind of common understanding, I think. And so just to give a last little thought on that, I think we have, like, when we talk about social innovation practice, we come up with solutions or responses to the complex challenge space. What kind of solutions are we really talking about? And do those solutions generate the change that we'd like to see? Or is it more incremental change? And if so, can we categorize the outcomes of our work in a way that allows us to insert them into like these flywheels of change? So anyways, just real quick thoughts on that, but that's a really good question that you're asking, Sony. And if anybody else wants to jump on that question, by all means. I'm also looking at the time. Any other questions? Like those are really good questions. I'd love to take one more, maybe.
There's one more in the chat, Greg. Or actually, maybe Kelly first, and then I'll go to the chat question after that.
Okay.
Kelly, go for it.
You go first. I'm still working on the question, but okay, I'm going to go ahead here. I'm just starting into a doctorate in business administration. So I think that I'm coming from a little bit of a different perspective. I'm going to put it back into the grassroots grasswork work that I did with community. So I didn't get paid. I haven't got paid for a long time. And I think that that was part of the success. And I'm just offering this out there that instead of change work, I'm using the word structural adjustment because I think that that has better resonance. It goes back into the 80s in terms of pre-Rio, that there was a shift in terms of economic, the environment. They were kind of meshing together. But the structural adjustment has a little bit more of a softness in terms of the small the small changes that the small wins that you make are kind of helpful, and it's not as threatening. Anyhow, I'm just going to leave it there and just see if that helps. I think it was Diane who asked the question.
No, I think that's a wonderful comment. At the same time, people that I know might say, "Oh, yes, but we're looking for more systemic change." And an example, I'll use a very quick example. So in Brazil, they have a new banking system that's all digital, and it was really bottoms up, and it transformed the banking system. It forced the big banks to adapt to this solution that was more bottoms up in terms of its emergence. And I think that's what I mean by being able to categorize different types of solutions that are the outcomes of our work, and identifying the ones that are more disruptive of the system. Because there's a very interesting article about this by Giels, who proposed the three levels of change: niche, the regime, and the landscape. And so technical solutions often have a more quicker adoption, but at the same time, they sometimes don't change the system. So how can we come up with social solutions that also disrupt the system? I think that's one of the challenges that we're faced with, and that type of disruption isn't soft. So just sort of to offer a more nuanced take on your very relevant comment. Thank you, Kelly. Do we have time for one more, Shikaing?
Yeah, we can go on for maybe the last question. Hadil asked in the chat, from your experience and in application to social innovation, how might this framework differ from using developmental evaluation,
Yeah, it's a really
or
good
maybe
question.
actually intersects in many ways?
It's very much complementary, and I was looking at the differences. I think that the main difference is what you're doing afterwards once you finish the developmental evaluation, which is a shared practice. So it touches on the third principle. I think what we're adding here are two things. The main one is centering the complex challenge space at the core of the framework, number one. And number two, the tools in terms of how do we communicate the changes, not only to the funders, but to all of the stakeholders. Developmental evaluation offers a good way to work together, but not necessarily tools for the storytelling aspect. And we're trying to emphasize that dimension, I guess, of the framework. How can we talk about change in more sophisticated ways that honor the complexity, the iterative nature, and that continue to center the learning and the relationships? So I think that's all the time we have for today. We will be sending out a survey, 3 quick questions about the presentation that we gave today. We do want your feedback because, as I mentioned, this is only the second iteration of the framework. We do want to prepare a final draft that social innovation will share with everyone in a few weeks' time.
Yes.
And one of the last things in that survey is, do you want to take part of a community of practice so that we can activate the ideas that this framework contains? So please answer the survey, and please let us know if you'd like to be part of the community of practice.
Awesome. Thank you all so much.